Hey everybody, welcome back to Brillianter. This is episode 5 of our Python Essentials course, and today we're going to be talking about nested loops. So if you remember back from episode 3, we talked about for loops, and I'm just going to write a little bit of code right here just to refresh your memory, just in case. And if you remember this sort of syntax for I in range 10, and then we print I, and we can run that and it will print the numbers 0 through 9. And if you remember this was our for loop. Basically we're just going through 10 series of steps and we're printing I, which starts at 0 and goes all the way up to 9. So now we're going to take this one step further and we're going to do two for loops, one within the other. And so this will create a neat little pattern that we can use in a lot of coding applications. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So let's say I have a for loop, right? Let's say I have for I in range 10, just like before. But this time, I also put in for j in range 10, right? And actually, let me make these 5, just in case, so it's easier to see here. And so, let's say I print j, and then I print actually, let's do it the other way. Let's print I and then print j. Okay, let's go ahead and run this. So as you can see, there's a bunch of numbers here. And let's go ahead and walk through this step by step so you can kind of see what's going on here. So let's start at the beginning. For I in range 5, right? What that means is we're going to loop through whatever's inside this for loop 5 times, since we've set it at a range of 5. And I always starts at 0, and it's going to go all the way up to 4. Within that for loop, we have another for loop that says for j in range 5. So whatever is inside of this for loop is going to run 5 times. The trick here is to notice that the second for loop actually runs 5 times. So these two statements inside of here are going to run 25 times because 5 times 5 is 25. So if we did not have this top for loop here, these two statements would only run 5 times. But since we have this for loop above here, it's going to run this for loop 5 times. And each time this for loop runs, it's going to run these print commands 5 times. So that's where we get that 5 times 5. So again, just to repeat, these two print statements will run 25 times. And we can actually see that here. So remember, first we print I, which starts at 0, and j, which also starts at 0. Then we go through the second loop of this. Remember, I stays at 0 because we haven't gone through this loop again. We're only looking at this loop right now. So again, I starts at 0, j starts at 0. Then this for loop kicks in one more time, and j goes up to 1. But I still stays at 0 since we haven't completed this full loop yet. So we print I, which stays at 0, and j, which goes to 1. Then we run through this inner loop one more time. I is still 0, but j goes up to 2 now. So we have 2 here, and I is still 0. Then another time, j goes up to 3, but I stays at 0. So 0, 3, then we get 0, 4. And now we've finished the first sequence of this loop. We've gotten j all the way up to 4. So now what happens is once this loop is over, it's going to go back here, and instead of I staying at 0, I is going to go up to 1 now, because we finished one iteration of the outer loop. Now we're going up again to do one more iteration since we're going to do it 5 times. So I goes up to 1 now, and j starts at 0 again because we're running this whole thing over from the beginning. So that's where we get 1, 0. Then I stays at 1 since we haven't finished the inner loop yet, but j goes up 1 more. So j now goes to 1 instead of 0. So now we get 1, 1. Then we get 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4. And since we finished this loop now again, j has reached 4, we're going to kick out of here and go back up to the outer loop. Now I becomes 2. And as you can see, it's just a sort of looping mechanism that happens 5 times 5 times, so 25 times. This inner stuff right here will run 25 times. Now, let's say I include another for loop, right? Let me just tab all these. Let's say for k in range of 5. Well, now this loop will run 5 times, which means this will run 5 times. This whole thing, all of these will run 5 times. This will run 5 times, which means this will run 5 times. And that's a whole lot of 5s, right? And that may sound a little bit confusing, but at the end of the day, all you have to look at is just where the loops are placed. So the outer loop is up here. This will only run 5 times. The inner loop, the middle loop, I should say, is right under the one that runs 5 times. So the middle loop runs 5 times by itself, but now that we're putting it inside of the outer loop, which also runs 5 times, this middle loop will run 25 times. So we just multiply these two numbers. Now if you look at the innermost loop, the one at the bottom, this one would run 5 times by itself. But it's inside of a loop that runs 5 times. So this 5 times 5 is 25. But the middle loop, if you remember, is inside of another loop that runs 5 times. So the inner loop actually runs 25 times, which means the innermost loop, the one at the bottom, will run 5 times 25 times, or 125 times. So it's all a bunch of multiplication, and it's a great way to really, build up your loops in a way that could make sense for your application. So let's say, in this example, right? Let's say we have a list, and let's say we make it like a 2D list, right? So something like this, and we can probably get into this in a different video. But just to show you a quick application of what this might look like, let's say we have a list here, and let's say we do this, and one more time. There we go. So this is our list right here. It's got 1, 2, 3 columns and 1, 2, 3 rows. So it's kind of like a tic-tac-toe board, right? And let's say we want to loop through all the different sequences in that list. So let me go ahead and actually, instead of making these all zeros, let's make these, oh, that should be a 4. Let's make these actual numbers to differentiate. Okay, so there we go. That's the actual list, right? And it kind of looks like a tic-tac-toe board, 3 by 3, which is 9 total squares. So we have our list, and let's say we want to go through each individual position on that list. Well, since it's got 2 dimensions, it's got rows and columns, we can't just do a simple for loop. We need a nested for loop, which means we need one for loop that goes through the rows and one for loop that goes through the columns. And that's why we use nested for loops if we want to go through multiple things. So let's say for I, or let's make this easier. For rows in range of 3, for columns in range of 3. Since there's 3 rows and 3 columns, we're going to set the range to 3. And all we're going to do is print, and let's make this board. There we go. Print board of rows, columns. There we go. So now, if you remember from our previous example, rows starts at 0, columns start at 0. So the first thing we're going to get is board of 0, 0, which means we're going to get that first number, 1. Then we should get board of 0, 1, which should give us 2. Remember, rows is going to stay at 0 because this whole sequence has not finished yet. And columns is going to go up 1 since it's in the inner loop. So just to rehash, make things a little bit more clearer, rows starts at 0, columns start at 0, board of 0, 0 gets printed first. And then we go through the second iteration of this loop, but we haven't changed this loop yet. So rows stays at 0 and columns goes up to 1. Then columns goes up to 2, rows still stays 0. But now that columns has reached 2, we kick out of this loop and go back up to the outer loop. So now when we do that, rows then goes up to 1 and columns starts over at 0. So we're going to get board of 0, 0, then board of 0, 1, then board of 0, 2, and then board of 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 0, 2, 1, 2, 2. Just like that. So if this works, it should print out all those numbers. Let me go ahead and refresh this terminal, and as you can see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. This is board of 0, 0, 1, board of 0, 1, which is 2. Remember, the 0th row, which is the first row, and the 0th column, which is the first column, so that's 1. The 0th row and the first column, 0th row, first column, remember computers always start at 0, so the first column is actually the second column for us, and the 0th column is actually the first column for us. So board of 0, 1, 0th row, first column, technically second column for us, would be 2. Then board of 0, 2 gets printed. Remember, 0th row, second column, so technically third column for us, which is a 3. And so that's sort of how that works, and that's why we would use nested for loops. This is just one simple application of it. If you're doing like a tic-tac-toe game and you want to check the position of each of the board spaces, then you could use a nested for loop. And yeah, things like these are where nested loops come into handy. So hopefully you guys were able to learn something today. Feel free to comment down below, ask any questions. I'll respond as soon as possible. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you next time for episode 6.